Hello everyone and welcome back to Let's Play Castlevania Circle of the Moon. In the last part, we finished off our time in the Underground Gallery fighting the Dragon Zombies boss in the process, and now that we have the Heavy Ring, we've made our way here to the Underground Warehouse, since we can now pretty much finish this entire area off, barring the occasional item here and again. There is definitely a more optimal way to do a lot of the item collection in this game, especially if you actively go after the area after this first, but that more has to do with how good the final movement upgrade is for getting items that we haven't been able to grab thus far in several rooms across the entire castle, really. So we technically saw one of these last time, but I was doing my outro, so I didn't really talk about it. We have a new enemy here, the Grizzly. They're the upgrade of the Werebear. They have a 1.5% chance at base to actively drop the same strength ring they could, which is nice for your strength stat against certain boss fights. But the big thing is, they have a 0.5% chance of dropping a piece of spiced meat, which, as I mentioned earlier, I believe, when used from your inventory, recovers your HP by 100. They are one of the best sources of that, unfortunately, and if you want that kind of healing item instead of, like, say, a high potion or something like that, you're going to be farming them a lot. I actively do attempt to do that later on. I'll discuss that more distinctly when we do that, but there's better sources of healing items, ultimately. They're just a good source of experience alongside a decent healing item, so depending on what you want to do, you might want to farm them along the way. We're actively on a side path right now in the Underground Warehouse, which I'm largely on right now to get some stat max-ups. The unfortunate thing is there's actively one I can't get until we get that final movement utility. So I could actively recommend coming back and doing this entire set of rooms on a second visit to the area just to make it more efficient, but the extra experience and potential for drops I think is too good to pass up alongside the stat max-ups you can grab at the moment. Big thing to watch out for, again, with these pushing block puzzles in the Underground Warehouse is you really need to pay attention to order of operations, observe the block layouts carefully so you can figure out which stone blocks you need to break in what order and what places you should put the other boxes in first. In the meanwhile, while I'm doing this, let's talk some more about the game's dev staff. Specifically, the next two people we haven't talked about yet are the remaining background graphic artists, because one of them is just the outright producer and planner, like we mentioned earlier, Koji Horie. The other two are Shoichi Maekawa and Toyokazu Nonoka. Maekawa started on the one Goemon puzzle game we brought up already in this LP via another credit, was a designer on Konami Crazy Racers, and after Circle of the Moon was a designer or background artist on Disney Sports Soccer, Basketball, and Snowboarding, all for the GBA. They're also on the boss graphics team for this very game alongside another individual. Toyokazu Nonoka, though, has one of the largest credits list on this game's entire staff. He started as a graphic designer on Rakuga Kids before working on Circle of the Moon here into Konami Crazy Racers and those Disney Sports GBA games, largely being a director for those projects. Since then, though, they've had quite the range of projects, to me suggesting they worked as a contractor early on before settling in as actually a producer at Nintendo, largely. Various credits include being a producer on the entire Mario & Sonic at the Olympic Games series, in fact working on many of the Mario sports titles in a similar role starting with Mario Superstar Baseball, all the way to this year's Mario Tennis Fever. Other projects include Xenoblade Definitive Edition, Xenoblade 3 and its DLC, and Xenoblade X Definitive, alongside Pokopia, Metroid Prime 4 Beyond, Princess Peach Showtime, Pokemon Legends Arceus, and ZA. Frankly, if it's a major spin-off for Mario or Pokemon the past good while, they're a producer on it more than likely. Next up is actively the sole graphics artist for pretty much every enemy design in the game, Shin Murato. They started as a designer on that Goemon puzzle spin-off we've mentioned already, before being a character designer on Poppin' Music for the Game Boy Color. After Circle of the Moon, they were a lead designer on Disney Sports Football, Skateboarding, and Motocross, directing all three of them as well. In more recent times, they've been a producer on that Eden Zero game, and were a producer and writer on Getsufuma Den Undying Moon from 2021. Notably, they're the other person who did boss graphics for this game alongside Shoichi Maekawa, so that team's also taken care of now. Next up in the staff is the sound director, who's also the sole person for this game's sound effects, Takeshi Iwakiri. They also did sound design for Beatmania and Poppin' Music on Game Boy alongside some of the PlayStation releases. But post-Circle of the Moon, they were largely put into Konami's soccer game division, be it World Soccer winning 11, 8, and 9, as it evolved into Pro Evolution Soccer from 2007 until 2012. They were credited as a sound producer across all of that. So something that I brought up earlier in the LP, I think it was during the Chapel Tower, was that this game likes having very large rooms that you go back and forth in various ways. The Underground Warehouse, as well as the next area, are probably the worst offenders of that, but I honestly think that, for at least what the area's central gimmick is, the Underground Warehouse here actually does it the worst in the game. If only because a lot of these rooms are only so large to make room for the block-pushing puzzles. Where again, if this game didn't have two of its major power-ups be tied to block-pushing in some regard, I think they could have just actively used the real estate here in more interesting ways. Though not for nothing, while I think this is a more one-note use of it, I do ultimately prefer this area to the next area, what it does with its large rooms, only because at least this moves at a more consistent pace than what the next area does. Now, you may have seen a moment ago, this room in specific also drops frames like mad until you start killing the enemies and breaking some of the stone blocks. And while it's, I think, the only room like this that does that, it does show that maybe this mechanic was pushing what they were doing with the system a little too far, potentially, and they probably could have rethought some things along the way. But not for nothing, it's also like the only time the game really does that. Even certain areas down the line that are filled to the brim with enemies don't usually drop frames like that, which is kind of odd. But one thing I should also note about this area is that if you mess up one of the block pushing puzzles, you can leave the room and reset it. But whenever you completely solve the puzzle, that actively saves, and if you re-enter the room, the puzzle is forever in its completed state. So you never need to redo the puzzles, really, outside of like the first block you need to push to make the platform get high enough. Also, something I neglected to mention last time, the poltergeists can also drop the cursed ring. I forget if I even use it during the boss fight because there's other options I have, but hey, it's nice to have one of them at least. Now, we are coming up with the boss fight of this area. In fact, if memory serves, the middle left exit of this room is the secondary save point for this area. You're really going to want the cross boomerang for this specific boss fight if you don't have it already. And the thing is, I can't remember if any of the candles in this area even drop that as a sub-weapon. Mind, as I've said across the LP, if you can get your hand on the cross boomerang, outside of cases you're going to want the stopwatch like the scary candle, you should really try your best to keep your hands on the cross boomerang. As for its cost, it probably is just the best sub-weapon in the game. We got a new enemy here, the Forest Armor. This thing actively swings its hand forward to create a vine whip that actively spreads it out at the very end, and that spread out can surprise you if you're not expecting it. They do have two notable drops. The Chainmail as their common at a 1.8% base drop rate, and the Rainbow Robe we've mentioned at a 0.45% drop rate. Now for nothing, the Chainmail is still pretty good at this point in the game, as that actively boosts your defense by 100, which is stronger than the Gold Armor I think I have on at this point. I don't farm for it myself, but if you want a better defense option at this point than what you might have, the Forest Armor right next to that save point there is probably one of your best options to do so for a little bit here. Especially because, again, it's a common drop, even if it is a low percent common drop. Ultimately might be worth your time. Now, I'm bringing out the Thunderbird summon for the upcoming boss fight just to show it off, as it's one of the best ways to actively take care of bosses in the game. But not for nothing, in this boss in specific, it's also just generally really effective. Out of nowhere, with no pomp and circumstance, it's time for our usual fight against Death. Death's got about 880 HP split across two phases, and I'm about to finish off phase 1 really quickly here because the Cockatree summon is also really good at warming through health. Phase 1 brings the usual sides that he's had since Castlevania 1 that spawn in at random and try to fly into you, but can be destroyed by a single physical attack, but also has a spread of spikes that leave his body like we saw earlier, and also has some fireballs he fires directly at you. Phase 2 is much more ground-based. This is actively where if you don't have the cross boomerang, I'd recommend having the Holy Water. Meanwhile, in Phase 1, I'd recommend having the usual axe instead. Phase 2 starts at about the halfway point of the HP bar, and it's this weird skeleton creature. It's probably one of Death's weirdest phases, honestly. The scythes from Phase 1 still actively stick around, but since he's limited to the ground now, he's actually much easier to cart around. When you're close to him, he tries to slap you with his scythe hands, and you can just keep a distance from that and use the boomerang to get around it. Otherwise, he'll put up a magic shield that actively slows you down when you're in front of him, meaning you have to dodge the slaps or the scythes a little more actively. Whenever he finishes that, he does do a little bit of a raise up before slamming down. If you're on the ground when he slams down, that earthquake damages you, and not for nothing, it is pretty powerful. Overall, this is probably one of Death's least threatening fights. Mind, it helps that he also has very little HP compared to most of the other entries, as pretty much every Death fight in the Metroidvanias after this lean heavily into the 4,444 HP trend that usually made him very tanky compared to boss fights prior to him and even after him in a lot of cases. I've always found the sound effect from this little black hole very silly. Our reward for beating Death is the Cleansing Necklace. Cleanse specific bodies of water so that they are safe to traverse. This is entirely to nullify a gimmick in the next area, as the water there is otherwise poisoned. We do have the standard golem enemy here, though. This enemy is very tanky with almost as much HP as Death had in total at 650. But if you actively want to farm this enemy, you can get two decent armors from it. Namely, it has a common drop at 1.3% of the Knight suit we've talked about, which has a pretty good defense stat. But its rare drop at only a 1% drop rate at base is the Steel Armor, which actively boosts Nathan's defense by 120. Not for nothing, That is a very good defense upgrade at this point at a drop rate that's relatively fair outside of how much HP the boss has. With that said, it also becomes a common drop 2 areas from now from a much easier to farm enemy, so it really depends on whether or not you want to go after it now or later. If you're going to go for it, I would recommend doing so now, as the golem in that room is much easier to farm than, say, this golem here, but it really just depends on what you yourself want to get done. We also have the Dryad enemies in this specific screen. I think this is like one of only 2 screens in the game they're in. Their only thing is to fire 3 projectiles at you that slowly home in before fading away. But if you want to farm a decent item for your hearts, you can do so from them. Specifically, they have a very low 0.2% chance, one of the lowest drop rates in the game, for a heart mega. Using one of those from your inventory restores your heart count by 100, and in at least one area, that can really make or break how you deal with things, especially if you're using things like the stopwatch or really relying on the cross boomerang as your only attack method in some cases like shooter mode. The kind of rough thing about the Underground Warehouse, by the way, is if you ever want to come back to this area, you do need to go through the main entrance back at the Triumph Hallway, because the only exit to this area that's not that one is that little slidey hole we just saw there. And that's going to bring us back to the vertical shaft we first fell into at the very start of the Catacombs. At the very least, though, it does put us right next to our next main destination, which is the room where we saw the Iron Maiden first in, back at the Abyss Stairway on the way up to the audience chamber. I think I make a quick pit stop into a room I barely entered at the start of the LP, though, because there's now a box we can push over there using the heavy ring. And if memory serves, that's also one of the better rooms to farm the Archdemon in for their DSS card, but I still don't do that yet. Also, now that we've defeated Death, the Catacombs in specific has gotten a lot of new enemies arranged here. Specifically, Grizzlies and Arachnes are now here, and those 2 specifically at the entrance of this room are 2 of the best enemies to farm, not only for experience, but for either healing items, in the case you actually get the spiced meat to drop, but also heart restoratives. The Arachnes in specific drop both heart highs at a 1.6% drop rate and the heart megas again at a 0.5% drop rate, which is much better than the Dryads. And not for nothing, it's also not a bad place to farm experience out. I almost decided to actively farm them for a couple levels, but I decided to leave that off for mostly the DSS farming wherever I need to do it, on top of when I want to do some item farming before tackling one specific area later on in the LP, just for the sake of keeping a move going. Now that we have the item that was in this room, though, we're going to actively head towards our next destination. And while I'm not a fan of the focus on the box pushing in the Underground Warehouse, this next area is probably overall my least favorite, if only because the gimmick is very hit or miss, and that's the side gimmick on top of the one that happens if you don't have the cleansing necklace after beating Death. Speaking of which, here we are. Welcome to the other side of the Underground Waterway. We found this place via the far end over by the Chapel Tower. We've already used the cleansing necklace for its main use, though. Specifically, upon first entering the water here, the cleansing necklace purifies it of the poison it has. Otherwise, if you enter the water in this area, you not only take damage, I think you also get the poison status element inflicted on you, which is just not very fun. But that's not the main gimmick of this area. The main gimmick of this area is the switch we just saw, and the blocks tied to it like the ones right to my right now. The switches make the blocks swap states from being in a staircase-like fashion to just being a straight line at the top of the staircase area. We need to trigger these switches to move those back and forth between those 2 states to make the paths through the areas, winding us back and forth across easily the largest rooms in this rendition of Dracula's castle. But the thing is, every time you hit the switch, the game pauses to move the blocks like that. Each pause lasts for about 5 seconds, which isn't too much on their own, but you do it back and forth so much in this area that it really builds up over time and gets to be really tedious. I'm assuming this is done to make sure you don't get yourself into a dead game state where you block yourself behind a specific staircase where there's no switch to save yourself. It's either that, or maybe in testing people got below the blocks as they were lowering or raising, and that just made you get pushed into the wall in a certain way they didn't like. And if that is the case, I get why it is the way it is. I just think they could have either sped up the movement or reworked it in a way where it's not as slow feeling. This is why this is ultimately my least favorite area. It's not even the enemies. Speaking of which, we do have the ice armors, who are surprisingly dangerous. They throw their ice spears either low, so you need to jump over them, or high, where you need to duck under them. But if they hit you, they freeze you. And similar to the stone status in a lot of the other games, if you get hit while you're frozen, you take absurd damage. It's enough to maybe 2 or 3 shot me at this point. so watch out. The ice armors do drop really good items though, namely their rare drop is a DSS card at a 1.2% base drop rate, but their common drop is the steel armor we were talking about a moment ago with the golem at a 2.5% drop rate, which is really nice, honestly. If you're going to be farming the DSS card anyway, get the steel armor along the way hopefully, and you'll be set for defense for a little bit here. Very good to get. I actively am already basically at my farming destination too, because the ice armor that's below me, just below this entrance, is easily the best ice armor to farm here, period. With that said, whether or not you come from above or from the left is a different question, because there's also a hidden room directly to the left of where that ice armor is. With that said, the card that the ice armors give us is one of the ones I use the least, but has the most useful niche uses, if that makes sense. Because if you plan to use that card ahead of time, it can really save you against specific bosses or enemies. But if you don't think to use it against those things, it can come across as pretty lackluster, especially with how potent its effect can be. And similar to the card we farmed up earlier in the LP that lets us use the summons, the effect of this card only really changes its element depending on its card combo. This specific farm didn't actively take me too terribly long. I think in total it took me about 20 to 22 in total ice armors, give or take a couple that I may have lost count on along the way. The card here is the Neptune card. What this card does is that it makes it so that you don't take damage from a specific element and absorb some of the damage that would have been dealt into you as HP. So, say Neptune Salamander makes you immune to fire damage. Or in the case of the Underground Waterway, a very useful combo is Neptune and Serpent. This makes it so that you don't take damage from any of the ice or water type attacks in this area and just absorb it back into HP. So, not only will I not take damage from the ice armor's main attacks, I also won't get frozen by them, completely nullifying the threat here. This is what I mean by the uses are niche, but if you plan ahead, they can be incredibly useful. Mind how useful that is will also depend on the room you're in and how willing you are to completely change your DSS setup very regularly, because I know there's some players, heck, I've fallen into this in some playthroughs, where I try to change my DSS as little as possible because I know I like this combo enough. If there's something that I wish this game had that some of the later DS era games in the series kind of lean into, it's a loadout option where maybe you press like down in R or down in L to swap between DSS combos you have favorited. Like, okay, I'm coming on a boss fight, I'm going to swap to the DSS combo that boosts my strength by 25. In this case, I'm coming up against an enemy that I know does this certain element, I'll swap to my defensive combo and all that. Because they do eventually smarten up with that in specifically, I think, Dawn of Sorrow, and I want to say Ecclesia has a similar element to it as well. That actively could really help the DSS combo system, I think, if only because then there's less swapping you'll have to do. So we're in a one-tile room, but you notice how the camera scrolled for once in it? This is a case where there's actively a hidden wall that you don't even have to destroy, you just walk right through it for another heart max up. That really stands out in this game, but a lot of these games have exactly one element like that, not for nothing. Heck, Harmony actively leans into that in one or two specific ways, which we'll see whenever I get to that game in however many years. I doubt it's going to be as long between me doing Circle of the Moon and doing another one of the games in this series as it was between Symphony of the Night into this. But that's also largely because the past little bit, I've largely focused on cleaning up most of the classic Vanias, because what's even left for those at this point for me? Technically Vampire Killer on MSX, The Adventure Rebirth, Rondo of Blood, and Dracula X Chronicles. I've been trying to do the former for years, but I just never get to it for one reason or another. But soonish, soon, I swear. Castlevania Chronicles I haven't done yet, and that's a remake of Castlevania 1. Heck, actually, that might make a good anniversary game, because we're coming up on 15 years in October. And, hey, why not? 15-year anniversary, do the remake of the game that started it all for me on the channel. That could be kind of fun. There's probably a couple of others I'm just forgetting about outright, but the point is, I've mostly run out of classic Vanias to do, and most of the Metroidvanias are what remains outside of me doing the 3D games at some point, and I'd really like to do Lament and Curse. Legacy of Darkness will be the one that makes me go, will I do that? I don't know yet. God knows there's already plenty of games I've been saying, I'll get to that eventually and just haven't yet, like Mario and Luigi Partners in Time, Golden Sun The Lost Age, because my Golden Sun 1 LP is probably over 10 years old at this point if I had to guess off the top of my head. Art and Ellico 1 and 2 I've been meaning to do for eons, but I just never find the right drive of how I want to handle those, especially considering some of the setup of stuff in Arts and Elko 2. There's a whole lot, and either way, I digress. Something I should note, by the way. The Manticore-Neptune combo does prevent you from taking poison damage, but what's kind of wild about that is it doesn't work on the water here if it's still poisoned in the Underground Waterway. That just deals normal elemental damage to you despite being poisoned water, which is a bit of a weird oversight, or maybe it's entirely intentional, I don't know, it just always feels kind of weird. In either case, though, the Frozen Shade there gave me the Star Bracelet. I brought those up earlier in the LP. Those have a different impact on your stats depending on whether or not you equip it to your left arm or right arm. And honestly, for this point in the game, one of the best setups you can get going is a Star Bracelet on both arms, as it boosts all 4 of your main stats a decent enough chunk where it's just nice and reliable. There are better ways to boost those stats individually at this point in the game, but for an overall package, you could do a hell of a lot worse, frankly. Now, at this point, if you're paying close attention, you might have noticed the other little oddity about the Underground Waterway. This is like the one area in the game that has basically no candles. So if you want to recover your hearts as you go through here, swap sub-weapons, you're kind of out of luck outside of using consumable items to restore your heart count. And that can be the real drain depending on what type of sub-weapon you like using in this, especially if you're someone like me who likes using either the stopwatch or the cross boomerang a lot in specific, as that means you might just be out of luck long-term outside of the rare case there's an enemy in here that can drop a DSS card you may have already collected, at which point they'll just drop a heart instead. But even then, that depends on the drop rates. Speaking of drop rates, we do have a new enemy in this area, the Witches, based off the Wicked Witch of the West from Wizard of Oz. Their main attack is to do a spread shot below them that aims generally at you. They have an incredibly low chance, like I think a 0.2% chance at base, to drop the Magic Robe armor piece. If you get that armor to drop from farming it, it's one of the best ones in the game and can last you the remainder of the campaign. It gives Nathan an extra 200 defense and 300 intelligence, meaning your MP recovery is going to be great. But I opted not to because I'm going to be farming out a specific armor down the line that's better than it and has a higher drop rate anyway, so not really my deal. But with that, I'm going to need to end this off here. Thank you guys for watching, and in part 8, we're going to finish off our time here in the Underground Waterway and use a new little tool we might find along the way to get a lot of other items across the castle. See you guys then.